Thank you for joining us for the first webinar in this new ESCoE series looking at economic measurement issues arising with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the pandemic has, of course, introduced many new and difficult issues for anyone trying to measure the development of the economy, both of a practical and a theoretical nature. And it has also led to new and urgent demands for data and economic statistics that can help us navigate this fast-moving and unfamiliar set of circumstances. So in this series, we will be considering what can be learned from novel data sources, as well as addressing methodological measurement issues specific to pandemics. And who better to kick this off than Jonathan Athow? He's Deputy National Statistician for Economic Statistics at the Office for National Statistics in the UK. And they have just released the Q1 UK GDP figures only yesterday morning. But before I hand over to Jonathan, let me just explain how we intend for the next hour to go. First, I should mention that this seminar is being recorded and will be made available on the ESCoE website in due course. And Jonathan, the plan is for Jonathan to speak for around 35 to 40 minutes, and we will have a 15 to 20-minute Q&A session after that. We will pause for questions for clarification a couple of times during the presentation. And if you would like to raise a question, please type this in the Q&A box. You should be at the bottom of your screen. You should have a little Q&A icon, and you can bring that up and type in something. And also, please, if you want to raise a question, can you raise your hand, not physically, but there's a little hand icon next to the Q&A icon. That way we can allow you to speak. And if we do ask you to speak, you'll need to unmute your microphone, and please mention your name and affiliation before asking a question. And I think that's it for now. Over to you, Jonathan.
Right, thank you very much, and it's great to be able to kick off this seminar. It's also slightly intimidating to be following in the footsteps of many other distinguished people who've spoken at ESCoE seminars. I'm going to take you through some thoughts on kind of where we are as an organisation in terms of managing the response to the pandemic and how we're adjusting what we are doing. What I will try and do is, I think, pick out what I think are some interesting research questions and some interesting thoughts for the future. Obviously, at the moment, we're still in the middle of this. We don't quite know how the next few weeks and months will pan out. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty. Some of what I'm talking about here is stuff, material we've already published and explained. But what I'll try and do is try and elaborate on that and give you a little bit more of a sort of focus. So I've got a few slides that I'll guide you through, but I won't overly bombard you with slides. And in fact, my first slide is actually just another header. I sort of wanted to sort of start with what has become my sort of favourite quote. This is from Tara Sinclair, George Washington University, and I think this just nicely sums up the sort of set of challenges we faced in economic statistics. Economic statistics is used to dealing with change. We're used to thinking about, well, sectors that come and go, new economic models, ways in which the economy is changing. But we normally see that change happen over years, if not decades, where actually what we've seen now is change that's happened in days and weeks. And this has just proved a very, very fundamental challenge. In many ways, the way economic statistics looked at the world, you could sort of see as a gradualist approach. Yes, of course, we brought in new data and new information and new techniques. But if you're talking about the UK economy of over £2 trillion, those changes would take a little while to feed through. So this has been, an unprecedented shock to the economy, and trying to mirror that shock into our economic statistics to really give an accurate picture of what is going on is a challenge we've never had to face before. So let me move on. I want to talk about sort of 3 sets of issues. Now, in reality, these get a bit blurred and kind of it's difficult to kind of know exactly which bucket some of these challenges in. They sometimes straddle across them. What we have is we've got some conceptual issues. So how do we deal with some particular issues? And I've got 3 that I will take you through. Sometimes these are sort of questions of how the national accounts should deal with a particular concept. And sometimes they're just much more fundamental things about kind of, well, actually, what does, and I'll come on to this, what does a measure of inflation really look like, and how should we consider it? There's a whole host of data issues, and I'll talk about some of the challenges with response rates. We know in some cases we are not seeing people responding to our surveys quite in the same way as they do normally. This raises a question of low response rates and in particular concerns around non-response bias. So there are some particular challenges we need to we need to face. And then, of course, then you need the methods for using this data. As I sort of mentioned before, you know, this sort of approach, the gradualism of economic statistics has sometimes been something that has been of great use to us, because we can use historical relationships between different economic variables to sort of nowcast or forecast the missing bits. But the one thing that is pretty apparent at the moment is many of those historical relationships just do not hold. And so what do you do around that? I think there's some really interesting sort of questions we'll need to face around all of these. And I think, again, in terms of where we are looking for support, you know, we will be looking for quite a lot of support there. But I wouldn't want you to think this is all bad news. This is all a degree of challenge. It's all about the challenges. I think there are some opportunities, and I'll come on to these at the end. So, you know, the pandemic and the need to have good data has forced us to increase our pace in terms of getting new data sources. We've already been using different data sources for a while. So VAT data has been used in the national accounts for 2 or 3 years. That's been really very valuable. But you know, it's raised the question about kind of what are those other data sources, and I'll come on to talk a little bit about those a little bit later. And with those data sources, we know there are going to be some really big research questions and some really interesting issues. You know, one that's been on our mind for a while is how we use supermarket scanner data or point of sale data in constructing measures of inflation. There's a really rich set of research there. I don't think the research community or actually anyone's sort of focused on single methods there, but there's a lot to be done there. But I think all of those new data sources are going to be a rich opportunity to think about kind of what is the right method for using this data. In the middle, there's something on accelerating transformation. I'll come back to this again later, but I think one of the questions we've got to face is, in some cases, to ensure our statistics are good, we've stood up some ad hoc data collections or done some ad hoc pieces of work, and many of those, once we get back to a more normal set of world, we will look to wind down. But in some cases, it's forced us to look to new sources, and actually there will be a question about whether we want to go back to the old ones and the old ways of working. I'll talk about that. And I think because of the challenges we faced, collaboration has never been more important. You know, the international community of NSIs has really come together to support and share best practice. Now, sometimes that's shared the view that there isn't a agreement on a particular approach, but it's been useful to have that debate. And actually, we've also been very richly supported in the UK. We've got a number of strong collaborations. ESCoE is one of them, but we also have a technical panel on consumer prices who can help support us. We've got something called the Economic Experts Working Group. We've got lots and lots of access to that collaboration, and that's been absolutely invaluable. And I'd like to thank everybody who's part of our wider network. So let's start with some of the challenges, but to put those in context, when the pandemic kicked off, and we first realized we were facing some of the challenges we had, we identified 5 key priority areas in economic statistics that we would look to protect. We knew there were going to be challenges in how we were producing our statistics. We prioritized 5 areas. So these are the areas you see here: prices, labour market, GDP, public sector, and trade. We then did a very quick sort of, not particularly formal, but a quick sort of analysis of kind of how high those challenges were for those different areas. And as you can see here, the degree of challenge for four of the 5 we scored as pretty high. Trade is the one I won't talk about that. So the big challenge there is about how you measure travel and tourism. But as there is no travel and tourism, the immediate issue is perhaps not quite as large. Then we've got these other four areas. I won't talk too much about the public sector aspects above and beyond the government output issue, because that's a key part of GDP. But in all of these, we've got particular challenges, and I'll come on a bit more to some of the details. But in prices, we used to collect a large number of price quotes from going out to shops, going out to restaurants. That's no longer possible. So we have to think about different methods of collecting data. Where we can collect price data, because of all the disruption that's going on, we're often dealing with slightly smaller sample sizes, or smaller sample sizes than they otherwise would, and we have to think about how that can affect our statistics. And we also just face this completely unprecedented scenario where large parts of the economy are just not available. For love nor money, in the UK, you cannot go and get a pint in a pub. So kind of how do you deal with that in consumer prices? Labour market, there are some issues, and I'll come on to this a bit later, but how do you capture furloughed workers? Certainly in British English, furlough was not a word that was used until very recently. So we've had to think about how those are properly captured. We also have problems with lower response rates. In our household surveys, our labour force survey had an element of face-to-face interaction. That's no longer available. We're using telephone and things like that. That's more challenging to get responses. GDP, there are these conceptual challenges. I'll come on to the job retention scheme later. We've got our own challenges there with response rates, business surveys, in particular issues. And then, as I said earlier, we've got some issues around imputation. It's often very common that we don't have all the data we need, and we need to impute for that we don't have. But some of those historical relationships are just no longer valid. So there's the pandemic in itself has had a number of quite profound challenges for us. So let me take you through some of those in a bit more detail. So I'll talk you through 3 conceptual issues. So the job retention scheme, for those who are outside the UK, the government has set up a scheme where workers who are not working because of coronavirus restrictions, the government will pay 80% of their wages. Now, we've never had one of these schemes in the UK, and the amount of money being spent on it is huge. So depending on exactly how you measure, between 20 and 25% of the UK workforce could at one point or are still covered by the job retention scheme. So if you think about that, 80% wages for 25% of the workforce, you are looking at very large amounts of money. So this is one where, you know, there are some international comparators, and we've looked at kind of how we should treat it. And the real sort of question here has been whether you see it as a benefit. Is it a benefit, a government benefit to workers, or should we see it as a subsidy? Now, this is an area where there are different views, and we've had those different views within the ONS. There are different people who have different views about the best way of treating this internationally, and also with some of our expert advisors. There hasn't been unanimity on how we should go about doing this. But essentially what we've done is we've treated it as a subsidy. And I'll explain on the next slide as to how that affects GDP. And then again, are these people employed or not employed? Well, it's pretty clear actually in the international guidance here that these people still have a contract of employment with their employer. We would see them as temporarily away from work. There are other scenarios in which people can be temporarily away from work. You could argue things like maternity and paternity leave. But then there's this real issue. I'll come to the end, and the next slide will take you through a bit on that one. That we've got, you know, 3 measures of GDP. They should, in theory, add up. They very rarely, they should all be equal. In reality, they very rarely do. So, but there's a challenge here that if the workers are not working, they're not producing any output. But if they're still getting wages and salaries, they've got some income. How do we square that particular circle? The CPI issues, so our consumer inflation measures, essentially we work on a fixed basket there, but there's a real challenge now that certain goods and services are just no longer available. How on earth do you have this fixed basket when you've got things where there is nothing to collect? And I think this is a really interesting issue, and I think Kevin Fox is on the call. I know he's been doing some thinking about this. I think this is a really rich area. Then finally, on the right-hand side, we've got education output. So for government output, where possible, we try and use direct volume measures of activity. And for education, particularly schools, we use basically what's equivalent of number of pupil hours of tuition. But in the UK, virtually all schools are closed. I think 95% plus of children are not going to school. How on earth do you deal with this? So let me take you through some of these. So some of these are a bit more, how do you imply national accounts? But I think things like, as I said, this concept of how you measure inflation and also government output is a really interesting area, I think. And actually, the pandemic has just shown how important that is, but also how interesting it is as a concept. So this slide tries to give you a sense as to how the coronavirus job retention scheme is being treated, and the top row gives you the job retention scheme. There's also an equivalent for self-employed people, which is the self-employed income support scheme or something along that lines, but a SACE at the bottom. So essentially, what we are doing is we're treating it as a subsidy. So the government is making a payment, and for those of you who know too much about the national accounts, that's given that fits into a D39 transaction. And subsidies bring down GDP. So in terms of the expenditure, the income measure of GDP, subsidies bring that down. So essentially, they're getting a subsidy. GDP falls by that amount. But of course, that is simply offsetting the wages and salaries that are being paid to employers, and we're still counting all the payments that employees are getting as wages and salaries. There's also some employer social contributions that go alongside that. But the net effect is that payments made under this scheme essentially do not impact GDP. Now there is a little, if employers want to top up the 80% to 100%, we actually take that off gross operating surpluses. So the essential story here is that these employees are not working, so therefore there is no output from these employees, and there is no income in national accounts terms attached to those employees either. So this is kind of how we square the circle, as I said, between GDP, the output measure of GDP, and the income measure of GDP. So that's where we've got to with that, but it still allows us to measure wages and salaries as they're paid through the payroll. And essentially, while the mechanics are slightly different for self-employed, we're doing the same same thing. The payments there are subsidy, so that brings down GDP. The mixed income, which is how we categorize self-employment earnings, then goes the other way. So this is kind of the framework we've chosen. It's still, we still say it's a provisional judgment because there's still ongoing debate internationally about the best way of recognizing this. As we're sort of going on for time, what I will do is I'll pause when I get to the end of these conceptual issues, but I'm certain we might well come back to this one. Then there's this interesting question of missing goods and services in CPI, CPIH. And this is really, I think, started to open a whole set of issues for how we deal with and how we conceptualize inflation. And this might be my overly simplistic view of this, but essentially CPI, CPIH, or your consumer price inflation, is trying to sort of measure two things. Firstly, if there is an idea of consistency over time, we want a measure that allows us to have clear long time series. The macro modelers want this. The people trying to look at changing prices over a long period of time. And at the same time, we want something that sort of says, well, actually, consumers, what are they spending their money on? What are those prices how are those prices changing? It's the here and now of what's going on. Now, I think in most times, apart from now, you always meet that through one index, and for most people, the CPI type index allows you to meet both of these issues. But now it's much less clear. As I said, certain goods and services are no longer available. And also that's a sort of supply side constraint, but we've also had a big demand side change. So certainly in the UK, road fuels consumption or sales are down massively. People are not traveling by car. So there's been big consumer shifts as well on the demand side. Now, where we've sort of got to on this one is essentially to try and keep CPI, CPIH focused on that long-term measure. And then can we develop supplementary indices that allow you to understand a bit more what's going on in the short term? So one of the things we're planning to do in terms of that supplementary index, and I think there are lots and lots of things you could do here, is to rescale the basket, excluding goods and services that are not available. So you basically rescale the weights to deal. Essentially, this is to deal with the supply shock that certain things are no longer supplied. Now, we're not reweighting because we don't have any better data on what consumer spending, how the demand side has changed, but you can reweight to deal with that supply shock. But as I said, this is this has started a very rich debate, and I know, as I said, Kevin Fox and Owen DeVert are thinking about exactly kind of how you might deal with these things. I think it's really quite an interesting, very interesting area. So, and then finally, I just want to talk about government output, and then we'll pause there. So, as I said, we normally collect number of pupils being taught in school, pupil hours. Essentially, we've moved where children are still taught in school. We're continuing to count that, but then for remote learning, we've put in place a new method. So we capture the hours of remote learning, but we adjust for two things. Firstly, we adjust for changes in teacher hours. So essentially here the idea is that, because it's teacher provided learning, if there are fewer teacher hours, then there's less being taught, less output. And what we've done is we've stood up a partnership with a private sector company that surveys teachers, and we asked them to do a survey of how many hours they are currently working compared to normal. And as you can see from the chart on the right, or hopefully see the chart on the right if it's not too blurred, is that in general we are seeing fewer hours worked by teachers, and in particular we're seeing fewer hours worked by primary teachers. So that's one adjustment we're making, and then we are also adjusting for parental output. So if a parent teaches a child, that is in national accounts term home production, so outside, not part of GDP, so we shouldn't be counting that. And again, we've got another chart. There's another chart in a note we published yesterday that says how much of that learning is being parentally supported. And what you find is, particularly for primary children, there's quite a high degree of parental input. So this is a new framework we've put up for creating education output. And as I said, on itself, the team who was responsible for this, I think, we've managed to do this in a few weeks, to put in place a whole new method. But it has raised a really interesting question, which was in vogue a while ago, and I think is coming back and is really important, is to kind of how do you measure government output in a particularly meaningful way. And I think this has just brought it to a head. So look, what I'll do is I'll stop there, and if there are any questions on the sort of conceptual issues we've touched on, otherwise I'll then move on to talk a little bit about some of the data issues, and then start to think about the opportunities for the future. So I don't know if I can see anybody's raising hands or raising questions. I don't know who's in control. Are you in control, Rebecca?
Trying to be. So we haven't had any questions so far. Nobody's raising their hands. Okay,
in which case I shall press on. There's lots of opportunities for people who want to ask questions later. Then data and methods, and I've already mentioned this, and I think this is a really interesting set of issues, and ones where we can start to think about it. But again, I think in terms of research, there's a really interesting set of issues that we need to think about and kind of think about how we might deal with. So a couple of particular issues which I've already highlighted. So business surveys, we have seen lower response rates there. We saw a particular fall around construction companies. That's partly related to the fact that they're one of our few parts of our data collection where we still send out paper forms. And obviously for businesses that are either working remotely or perhaps not open at all, actually paper forms is not a particularly great way of getting in contact with people. If you send something to your work address, but everyone's working from their home address, it just sits in the post room. So that's a particular challenge there. And then I said the labour force survey. Now, in both of those areas, we've had to think quite quickly about how we might put in place methods to allow us to understand the challenges there, So we're very mindful of non-response bias. So in the construction sector, we did a particular deep dive into that sector. We did a sort of focused survey of the non-responders to understand if they're very different from the people who did respond, and that was quite reassuring that there were some differences, but not very much. We also did things like web scraping. So we have looked at scraping websites to see if that tells us if the businesses cease trading. You know, have they got an announcement saying they're not trading because of COVID? So there are a number of things that we're doing there. But again, I think there's a whole set of issues that you know, as we work through this around non-response labour force survey, as I said, particular. Now we have some benefits from the current labour force survey in that it's a wave structure. So actually, it's only really the first wave who've not been able to use the face-to-face interview. The subsequent waves we tend to use by telephone anyway. So there have been some things there. And as I said, in some cases we've changed mode of collection, so it's not just sample size. So as I said, we've moved from collecting prices in shops to collecting prices remotely, either via the internet or telephone. And we've moved, as I said, from face-to-face to telephone or online channels. So one of the things we've stood up is a new labour market survey, but that's online only. And there's real issues here we have to think about in terms of mode effects and non-response bias. And if we do start to, for example, put more weight on online collection, how do we understand that mode effect? How do we understand what's the most meaningful estimate? So there's a set of issues here that I think are really quite interesting. And just for as I was talking through that construction example, somebody did remind me that construction will be online for next month. So we've already dealt with some of those challenges. But the more general problem of getting businesses to respond is really important. Businesses have got a number of different things that's going on. So let me move on and then talk about new data sources. In some ways, this is not something where we're starting from scratch. And we have at the bottom, we have things we are using at the moment. So we're using VAT data in our measure of GDP. That's been very successful. It's allowed us to get a lot of detail on the economy that we just didn't have before. You know, it's a near census of all businesses in terms of their outputs. Now there are some challenges around that, and again, one of the real successful things we've done is work with for example, ESCoE to help us develop some of the methods for doing that. Then we've got some areas where we've got working train. As I mentioned, scanner data is a particularly interesting set of issues, and there's a lot of work going on around the right methods there. So for those outside the UK, RTI, PAYE information, whilst it being a very long acronym. So this is payroll data. Every time somebody in the UK is paid, the tax authority is given that information. And that is very timely. So virtually we have 100, you know, every month we have almost a complete data on everyone being paid that month. That's potentially really very useful. We've already got some indicators of that we publish alongside our headline economic statistics. But then there's a whole set of things on the top row that we are working on that have really come to the fore in terms of the pandemic. So there's real interest in understanding transaction data. So this is normally card level transaction data, and given the very high level of card use, and actually pandemic has driven even more card use, There's a really interest in how you understand that and how you look at that. But then also, actually, can you, for example, use some of the transaction data to understand business to business transactions? Really interesting. Vacancy data, obviously, huge numbers of job vacancies are online. How might you put together an indicator there? And then there's an interesting question about what we call business births and deaths, so the creation and wind down of businesses. How can you bring together various data sources around that? I think all of these new data sources, there's, in many cases, there is no single agreed, well-used methodology we can just slip into. We need to work, and I think there's a whole set of sort of research questions about how best to do that. So again, I think there's some real opportunities here. Let me just a couple more points just to before I bring this to a close. So this is the point of accelerating transformation. So since March, we have developed and launched 3 new surveys. So we've got a new business survey called the Business Impact of Coronavirus Survey. We've got a new opinion survey, or a refreshed opinion survey that's now weekly, looking at how people are changing their behaviour in light of coronavirus. And as I mentioned, we've already launched an online labour market survey. This was something we'd had in development for a longer term, but we rushed it into production because we thought it would be useful at this particular moment. And we've also we're also, with the University of Oxford, developing a COVID infection study. So we are doing a random sample of the UK population to test them for whether they have coronavirus at the moment, and also to do antibody testing. So this has been a huge amount of new things we've stood up. Now, some of these will inevitably become less important. So they can, hopefully, once we start to manage and see the pandemic winding down, and the COVID infection study will wind down with it, or shortly afterwards. Not my call exactly on that one, but you can see it's potentially time limited. But we've got this labour market survey up and running. So would we stop it now? This new survey, this new channel. So, and again, likewise, we've had to pause some outputs because we just don't have the capacity to manage everything with all the changes we're having to make to our outputs. And so really there is a question now about whether we're not going to turn the clock back to exactly how we were before. Which of these things do we want to accelerate? And if it is, for example, the labour market survey, and we want to put more weight on that and less weight on the labour force survey in future, all these questions about mode effect, all these questions about non-response bias become much more important. So I think as we start to think about this acceleration of transformation, there's going to be a whole set of research questions that's going to be raised here as well. Well, where does this all leave us? And I was just trying to, this is just a few thoughts of kind of where can I see economic statistics going? Well, as I said, this demand for high frequency data, that's clearly come out very, very strongly in the pandemic, and I can't really see that sort of going. I can't see people saying, "Oh no, we've had this really timely data. Go back to something else." And I think we are, these new data sources, the ones I talked about, we need to exploit those, but we need the methods, and we need a lot of work to understand them. Talked about imputation and particular issues. I think this might cause us to look back at a lot of what we do and think about kind of are the different ways of doing things. So for those people who are interested in sort of those nowcasting, forecasting methods, and we've used that a lot. We've got some really good projects with the Fraser of Allender Institute on nowcasting, but I think that could become much more of an active area of research interest. As I just sort of said, we're not going to just reset the clock. So how do we work to understand those transition effects? As I said, I don't know what the new normal is, but we are going to end up with some perhaps quite different sets of economic policies, economic levers, and how on earth do we think about those? The UK Chancellor announced earlier this week some changes to the job retention scheme for the future. If we end up with more wage subsidies, lots and lots of ways in which the economy is changing. One of my slides earlier said that the UK government has announced 30 separate schemes, and all of these things need to be understood and properly accounted for. And then I think there's this question of rapid economic shifts. I think it was, I can't remember if it was Rebecca or Kate Barker who made a comment to me the other day that some aspects of our capital stocks are going to look like stranded assets, and kind of how do we deal with that? Large office blocks in the centres of London suddenly start to look like they're much less valuable if we're trying to understand the economy and its productive potential. Measures of productivity and multi-factor productivity and those sorts of things. How do we account for all of those sorts of things? So I think there's a really, really rich set of issues we have to deal with. Some of them are here and now. Some of them will come in the future, in future weeks. Some of them perhaps are quite long-term issues. So that's kind of where I wanted to sort of leave it. I hope that's given you a sort of sense of kind of how we're approaching this, some of the issues we're dealing with, and as I said, really in this last slide, I'm just trying to start thinking that we need to start, looking to the future. And starting to anticipate now some of the challenges and some of the opportunities as well that we're going to face in the future. So that's kind of all I wanted to say, and really now open to questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we have a few questions coming through, and I think we'll take a couple at a time. So we're going to unmute some of the people who have raised questions. So if I could ask Bernard Goldhammer to raise his question, and also, and after that, Ariel Lewis Virkierman. Please go ahead, Bernard.
Yes, hi, I'm Bernard Goldhammer from the European Central Bank, and my question was, Jonathan, you were talking about changes in consumer spending, and this could be seen from a CPI. Actually, I think a CPI is also in normal times not the indicator which is designed for that, but it's actually the retail trade figures. So and actually, when you now look at the retail trade figures, you can see the shifts. Already there's data up to March, I think, available. You can see the shifts to food, basically, away from, because of lockdowns, because from clothing, for example, and to online sales. So something that you didn't mention is there are actually indicators there that tell you some parts of the story, but you have probably to look at them. So I think new data sources is fine, but also your existing data can tell you parts of the story, but probably not in the domains where you usually look at it. That's my question, basically.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think one of the before I deal with that specifically, I think one of the issues that the pandemic has brought to light is that you have to join up and be much more look at statistics across the board. You may have some data over here, but actually there's something over there that you wouldn't normally look at that sometimes brings it together. So I think, yes, the retail sales is really quite interesting. It does give you that sense of how consumer patterns are shifting. the challenge with all of this, again, is sort of congruence of data and concepts. And are we reporting retail sales at the level of granularity that would allow us to, for example, reweight a basket? Now, it might well be that you can have a start there, but it might be there are other sources. So, for example, scanner data, if we'd had that, that would allow us almost to reweight much more in real time. So you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to say there was no way of doing it. It's just a bit harder and more challenging to perhaps have the degree of precision that you would be people might be looking for.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And can we ask now for Ariel Lewis Wierkerman to ask his question?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Ariel Wierkerman. I'm based at Goldsmiths, University of London. I wanted to quickly ask if you could please be able to expand on how the mismatch between the three perspectives on compiling GDP, output, expenditure, and income is being solved as a consequence of the implementation of the job retention schemes for employees and self-employed, specifically, if possible, as regards the expenditure view of GDP. Thank you very much.
So again, I probably focused on income because I think that was where it's been most sorry, it's most obvious. But I think you're absolutely right. You've got the expenditure measures, and again, what we will do is we'll rely on our sort of subsidy approach. But because the money is against it being paid as a subsidy, it will come off GDP. So in that sense, you should, that way there are no logical or differences between them. The output of these workers is not measured, where there's no income associated with them because we've netted off the subsidy, and there shouldn't be expenditure again related to it because we've netted that off. So in that sense, it should be coherent across the three, at least at a first order. Now the real challenge is in more generally there is a problem, as I said, you know, our balancing is always a challenge. I think because of the massive shocks we're seeing, there's a particular problem with timing. Are we picking up, for example, the job retention payments when the wages are being paid? Are we matching the period? So there's going to be some really big issues in terms of implementation. Now, so far, the Q1 GDP only, you know, obviously the sort of the restrictions in the UK only came in on the 23rd of March. So we've only got a relatively small period to do this. But when we get into Q2, getting all those timing, getting all that data aligned is going to be really hard. So hopefully that gives you the idea of how the concepts work. But as I said, more generally, it's going to be really quite challenging.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. And I would like to take a question from Stephen Pennick. Stephen Pennick.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks, Jonathan. Can I start by thanking you and your colleagues for all you're doing to continue to get the statistics published, and also dealing with the many challenges that you've described, because I think it's a really formidable effort. I'm interested in some of the data and the methods issues that you've outlined. For example, the LFS, you're now doing telephone interviewing from the first wave. Presumably, when you write to prospective contributors, you're having to ask for telephone numbers, and I'm just wondering how effective that's proving and whether in fact you're keeping your response rates up.
So there were two sort of problems, and it's still a bit difficult to know kind of where the response rates will end up. So when we stopped our face-to-face interviews when the restrictions came in, we also shut down our contact center in the office and moved everyone to home working. So our current contact center staff doing the phone calls are doing that from home. Our current field interviews are also occasionally using phones at home. So there was a disruption from literally having to get people out of the office and set up at home with the right kit. So that just meant the response rates in general fell because there wasn't anyone to do the phones. We did find getting phone numbers is quite difficult. And you know, certainly I, as somebody who doesn't really ever pick up my landline, even if somebody did phone it, they wouldn't get an answer. So we've tried a number of different ways, and we're getting better at getting phone numbers and getting people to respond. And we are sort of thinking then about whether we move to a different model. You know, can we, for example, if we're not going to be visiting people face to face, can we knock on their door and ask for a phone number, or ask them to nudge them into responding? But we've had to make this, you know, we're having to sort of innovate in real time here. As I said, we have seen a fall in the response rate of the first wave of the LFS. I haven't seen the final numbers, and more generally, the LFS has been under pressure for us for a while. You know, we've been having about 55% response rate, so it is quite challenging. As I said, there is the good thing about the LFS is because it happens over 5 waves. It's been the first wave that's been affected most. The other waves haven't been yet. We're also then we've got some data we can triangulate against. So we've got a business survey that's looking at that helps us understand a bit about employment. We've got this new labour market survey online. That's for a brand new survey that we've stood up very quickly. We're getting quite good responses there, so that's another way of getting data. And we're also looking to double the sample size of the labour force survey. So even though response rates might be lower, we can broaden the pool of people. Now, of course, all of these are imperfect solutions, and we need to sort of monitor. But at the moment, that feels that we've got some plans in place to keep that to keep those statistics going. And as I mentioned, we've got access now to or working with HMRC on real-time information data. So for employees, we know how many employees were paid in a particular month, and from next week we're going to be publishing median earnings for those employees as well. So we've got other ways of looking at what's going on in the labour market.
Thank you, Stephen, and for the response, Jonathan. Just before we move on to some more questions, Jonathan, you might want to respond to, there's been a few people getting in touch just to say whether some of these new data that you're collecting will be made available to other researchers. And I certainly seem to recall I received an email from the RS either yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, so our aim is to put as much as we can into the secure research service. So I know it's not a particular, not particularly economic issue, but this COVID infection study, all the data will go straight into the secure research service, and we're trying as far as possible to make access to that as remote as people can do it remotely. Now, there is a bit of a challenge that with some of these new data sets, it will take a little while for us to work out how best to put that data in the secure research service. So, for example, I mentioned scanner data. We need to work out what the best way of doing that is. But the intention is that everything will go in there. But as I said, in some cases, we're going to just have to work out ways in which we can do it in ways that protect the data as far as possible. But that will be the general aim, will be to ensure that the individual data can go into our research settings for researchers.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I think now we'll take a couple of questions. They're a bit related. So one from Peter Dalton, and then after that from, I'm afraid I can't see the name, it says Galaxy S10. We'll start with Peter Dalton. Peter, are you able to unmute your microphone?
I think Peter is no longer on the call.
Okay. Okay, so Peter was asking, in the basket of goods, which goods which are now not bought, can we partially substitute from disaggregated supermarket data? So would beer bought in supermarkets substitute for beer bought in pubs?
I think this is a very difficult, I mean, it's a very, it's back to this question of kind of how do you measure these demand shifts that may have happened. I think there's going to be a very rich set of options there for trying to re-weight, whether it's from pubs to beer bought in shops, whether it's from restaurant meals to takeaways, lots of ways you can think about it, but actually trying to get hard data to allow us to do that is a bit more challenging in real time. And I'm glad nobody's asked me about how we're going to do the weights for the CPI basket in a year and a half, or whenever it comes to that. I will leave that. I'll leave that to future Jonathan to sort that one out.
And do we have Galaxy S10 still on the call?
I'm wondering if this is Elon Musk's child.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
It's actually me, Amina.
Oh, hi, Amina.
Just wondering, because of monetary financing, it's very important to calculate CPI quite accurately. So are we adjusting rapidly our basket of goods, like monthly, or is it just fixed for some time?
It is going to be fixed, and in many ways, as I said, it's quite difficult, because if you did change the basket, how would you then compare it to next year? And again, the weights and the changes of that. Now, obviously, we do change the basket year on year, but most of those changes are pretty incremental and allow us to have that consistency of measurement over time. Now, all the data is going to be there, and as I said, I think what might be helpful at the moment is not to change the CPI/CPIH, but to calculate a supplementary index that might capture some of those things. And I know Kevin has got a really interesting paper with lots and lots of different ideas for how you might do that. So I think there's going to be a really live debate to get around this. And again, it's something the Bank of England's fascinated in themselves, because they've got an inflation target and they want to know kind of, are there any quirks we might see in that in terms of them meeting their targets. So I think it's really, your point is a very, very good one. I think our natural approach here is to, if not be cautious, to think through quite carefully what the consequences are of for example, changing baskets in year.
Okay, thank you. Can we ask for a question from Dev Verdi about the regional accounts? Dev Verdi.
Hello, sorry, I was having problem unmuting. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask whether you could say something about how ONS will deal with the effects of coronavirus on regional accounts, possibly differential impacts on different parts of the country.
So at the moment, there's still a bit of a challenge for us in terms of some of the disaggregations of our data are going to be harder. Almost a sort of just a consequence of lower response rates. This means sample sizes are smaller and therefore become less reliable further down the sort of hierarchy you go. And so there's a real challenge for us about kind of how we continue to produce regional data. And at the moment, we've prioritized the national data, the UK-wide data, and put most of our effort into doing that. So we will come back to these questions of sort of either regional and sometimes sectoral. People are also really interested in the sectoral breakdown. So we will have to come back to that later, but that is going to be more challenging to do simply with the data limitations. And also we've had to, as we've sort of explained, had to stand up new methods for education. So there's a limited amount of bandwidth, and we've had to direct it more into the UK-wide indicators than sub-national indicators.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Can we ask Rachel Scarf to unmute?
Oh, hello, I'm Rachel Scarf from the University of Edinburgh. So I'd like to ask about measuring the gig economy, because I know that the ONS is thinking about ways to do that, partly through the labour force and through other ways. And I was wondering if that work is still ongoing and whether those people will be picked up, or are there any specific questions relating to that in the online labour market survey you were talking about?
That's a really good question, and as I said, more generally we have had to reprioritize some people away from some of the projects. But again, this is one where actually this might be an opportunity where we can accelerate as it's a transformation, because we've got an online labour market survey. Online surveys are much easier to change the questions of. We're for example, we're interested in whether people who are on the job retention scheme, you're allowed to take a second job, so or further other employment. So we're really interested, for example, in whether people are going to be doing that. And for example, one option would be the gig economy for people to do that. So I don't know if we've got anything in train at the moment, but certainly the labour market survey, because it's online, allows us a much more much more flexible way of and we can tailor questions quite quickly. So I don't know on the immediate, but there is an opportunity here from having these new data sources.
Great, thank you.
Can we ask, this will be the final question, Maria Pettersson from Statistics Sweden.
Maria, are you on mute?
Maria, are you able to unmute your microphone?
I don't think she's able to unmute her microphone.
Okay. Well, she's asking how you treat healthcare services. So there's data on the number of COVID-19 patients, but are you able to capture the loss in health output due to cancellation of other treatments?
In theory, yes. But again, there is a real challenge with getting access to the data. So for healthcare, the output of the government or public sector health sector, too many sectors there, is measured by a cost-weighted activity index. So we look at broad categories of activity, such as acute, elective care, general practice, those sorts of things, and we are seeing shifts. Elective care essentially is no longer being carried out, so we're able to see those changes. The challenge is getting the data, particularly in a timely way when our health sector is fully engaged with managing the pandemic. There's a real challenge around the data. Now we've been able to find ways through that and find particular proxies, but we are seeing falls in parts of the health sector. So obviously acute and emergency care has gone up and elective care is going down. So we are trying to measure that as best we can.
Okay, thank you very much. I think our time is up. So thank you, Jonathan, for a fantastic overview of many challenges in compiling key economic statistics at the moment, and also for explaining how ONS are dealing with these issues. Thank you to everybody for their participation and all of your questions. Our next webinar will take place in 2 weeks' time, and this will be given by Professor Kevin Fox from the University of New South Wales, who will talk about measuring real consumption and CPI bias under lockdown conditions. And I think invitations will be going out early next week for that. Thanks again to everybody.